Two daughters of the same king, two halves of a fractured dynasty, two souls bound by blood, yet torn apart by faith, politics, and fate. They were Mary Tudor and Elizabeth Tudor, the first two queens of England, opposing symbols in the turbulent age of the Tudor reign. At first glance, Mary and Elizabeth could not have been more different. Mary, daughter of King Henry VIII and Queen Catherine of Aragon, embodied the old Spanish Catholic tradition, devout and principled. Meanwhile, Elizabeth, the product of Henry's scandalous marriage to his second wife, Anne Boleyn, grew up in an atmosphere of religious reform and modern thought, carrying within her the instinct to survive in an unforgiving court. The relationship between these half-sisters was far more than a family matter. It was a perfect metaphor for the deep divisions shaking England in the 16th century. Catholicism versus Protestantism, tradition against reform, blood legitimacy versus political calculation. In the collision of these forces, the tragedy of Mary and Elizabeth began, marking the prelude to one of the most defining chapters in England's destiny. Mary was born in 1516, in a mix of joy and disappointment for her parents, a daughter, not the hoped-for heir, yet living proof of Queen Catherine's fertility after years of miscarriages and stillbirths. During her early years, Mary was educated as a true Spanish princess, well-versed in theology, fluent in Latin, skilled in music and courtly manners, a precious jewel meant to strengthen European alliances through a strategic marriage. However, those hopes quickly crumbled when King Henry VIII began to drift away from Mary's mother, partly because Catherine had failed to produce a son, and partly because his gaze and heart had turned to a younger woman, Anne Boleyn. This affair not only destroyed a 20-year marriage, but also shook the religious and political foundations of the realm. When the Pope refused to annul the union, Henry broke away from Rome, declaring himself head of the Church of England, ushering in a fierce reformation. From that moment, Mary's fate began to darken. Once adored as the jewel of the court, Mary was stripped of her title, declared illegitimate, and forced to acknowledge Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, as the rightful princess. She was torn from her mother, isolated from court, and reduced to a pawn in the political game of the very father who once cradled her with pride. Worse still, she was made to live as a servant in the household of her half-sister Elizabeth, the child whose birth had ended her own childhood. To Mary, Elizabeth was more than a sister. She was a symbol of disgrace, the living embodiment of a sinful marriage never recognized by the Catholic Church. In Mary's eyes, Elizabeth lacked legitimacy, born of heresy and incest, a thorn piercing the proud Catholic identity she and her mother represented. From then on, Mary's heart burned not only with resentment toward her father, but with a consuming hatred for the sister who had, whether by accident or fate, stolen her place, her honor, and her future. Yet Elizabeth was no naive child amid the storm. From an early age, she learned the art of survival within the Tudor court, where a single misstep could lead to the scaffold. Her silence, wit, and adaptability became her shield, while Mary sank deeper into bitterness, fanatic faith, and a desperate dream of restoring Catholicism. When the crown finally returned to Mary in 1553, following the unexpected death of her brother Edward VI, the silent struggle between the two women entered a new stage, one destined to be celebrated as Gloriana, the other condemned as Bloody Mary. Two sisters, two symbols of an era. Their battle would not only decide power, but the very soul of a kingdom. Darkness began to spread like a cold mist, slowly wrapping itself around the grey stone walls of Greenwich Palace. In silence, a young girl sat motionless by the shuttered window, pale moonlight casting shadows on her tightly clasped hands over her faded grey silk gown. The wind slipped through broken tiles, hissing softly like whispers from an ancient world. Mary Tudor, no longer Princess of Wales, now merely Lady Mary, quietly counted each beat of her heart, as though seeking order amidst the chaos. In the dense darkness of rejection, fragmented faith, and stolen status, she had nowhere to rest. Not far from there, at Westminster Abbey, theologians and nobles gathered, debating fiercely over the legitimacy of the king's new marriage to Anne Boleyn. To wed her, Henry VIII had broken the sacred bond with the Roman Church, an act unprecedented in English history. This occurred in the year 1533, when the newly appointed Archbishop Thomas Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon null and void. Thus, the Church of England was born, and Henry named himself Supreme Head, a strange title, both regal and sacred. What few people know is that on the very night the king wed Anne, a strange storm swept across the Kent coast, tearing holy cloths from the chapel at Canterbury. Some records describe a dim red light flickering along the horizon, a phenomenon the folk called the breath of an angry spirit. Yet no official church document confirmed it. Only the monks whispered that the night wind smelled not of rain, but of incense and sin. Historians still debate whether Anne Boleyn truly loved Henry VIII, or if she was simply a cunning woman who used the king's affection to climb the throne. Some scholars argue she was the first in the Tudor court to grasp the art of modern power, shaping public image, maintaining mystery, and wielding desire through restraint. Others see her as a victim of brutal court games, where death waited behind every smile. But what of Mary, the girl left behind? Everything in her had changed. Her Latin lessons, music studies, church history, once her mother Catherine's pride, were now dusty memories like soot on an old page. At Eltham Palace, where she had been sent, the wind howled down long corridors, and her footsteps echoed alone. No attendants, no greetings. She often sat by the windowsill, fingers tracing invisible circles in the cold glass. Each night before sleep, she read the Latin Bible, her unshaken ritual, and every time she whispered, Pater Noster, quies in caelis, her voice trembled with memories of her mother. Catherine, the proud Spanish queen, now locked away in Kimbolton, forbidden from seeing anyone. Mary was banned from writing, from sending gifts. She was severed from the only person who had ever loved her. Outside the window, an owl cried in short, lonely bursts. The breeze crept beneath the old wooden doors. Sometimes she pressed her ear to the cold wall to hear the faint echoes from the small chapel, where people now prayed in English. She never knelt there. Her faith would not permit it. In the heart of darkness, Mary did not surrender. Instead, she learned to live in silence. Each time she was forced to sign papers declaring herself illegitimate, she refused, her grey-ash eyes meeting the official's gaze, saying without words, I am the true daughter of Henry and Catherine, and no one can take that away. There is a little-known note, dated from the year 1535, when Anne Boleyn was pregnant with Elizabeth. An anonymous friar wrote, A queen born of defiance will birth an age of unrest. Though the prophecy was never proven true, Mary's supporters later clung to it as evidence of the unholy legitimacy of Anne's line. Modern scholars continue to argue over how Mary's troubled youth shaped her rule. Some claim her harsh childhood made her rigid and extreme, leading to the burnings of Protestants. Others see a natural response from someone who lost everything, family, name, faith, and had to fight alone to reclaim it all. Mary was not merely a figure in history. She was the echo of rejected memory, persecuted faith, and unwavering loyalty to her mother and to God. When night falls and wind whispers through old stone corridors, they say you can still hear soft Latin chants, a lullaby perhaps, from the heart of a girl once called Princess, once called Hope, and once the shadow of an unfinished reign. Footsteps as soft as morning mist brushed against the stone-tiled floor, echoing one beat at a time down a long, shadowed corridor. The tall candles on the wall cast flickering golden light, glowing like fireflies caught in still air. In this place, once the heart of power, where voices rose to praise the king and songs of courtly joy filled the chambers, now only the breath of silence remained, faint and steady. Mary Tudor lived in quietude, like a breeze passing through a cloister. No longer titled, no longer royal, she had become a shadow placed aside adrift among layers of history and glances of polite neglect. In a world ruled by ceremony, tradition, and the tolling of church bells, she carried within her a silence more resounding than any decree. On the 7th day of September in the year 1533, Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, was born in the same palace where Mary herself had once opened her eyes to the world. Ironic, or perhaps cruel. Mary received no formal announcement, yet the news reached her swiftly through sighs and whispers of servants. Elizabeth, a child born of a controversial marriage, was hailed as a princess while she, Henry's firstborn, was demoted to lady and forced to retreat into the shadows of the very throne she once approached. A recognized event in history, Elizabeth's legal placement as heir to the crown led to the rewriting of succession laws. The new act, passed in the year 1536, officially declared both Mary and her mother Catherine stripped of all royal rights. It was not merely paperwork, it was a stone on the chest of a girl. The red carpets once laid beneath her feet were now rolled out for a child just learning to speak. Few know that during this time, Mary once refused to leave her chamber for many weeks. She had a pendulum clock, stopped at the last hour. Her mother was alive, an odd ritual some servants called madness. The clock hands never moved again, and no one dared to touch them. Every sound, brooms sweeping, distant hoofbeats, creaking wooden doors became a slow symphony in a wordless tragedy. Historians still debate the nature of the relationship between Mary and Elizabeth in their early years. Some records claim that Mary, despite her pain, never showed overt hostility to the infant. There are even accounts that Mary once held Elizabeth in her arms, just once, when she was only a few months old. Others argue such claims are romantic fabrications, attempts to soften a rivalry that history carved deep with steel and silence. Beyond the palace walls, winter crept in. North of London, clouds hung like weary soldiers retreating from war. Each morning, Mary walked slowly across the cold stone courtyard, always alone. No handmaidens, no tutors, no affectionate voices. Once, she bent to pick a fallen white rose shed from a bush planted by her mother in the west garden. She held it in her palm the entire morning, then pressed it between pages of her Bible, as if anchoring a piece of the past within the cold breath of the present. In the court, a world defined by power, Mary existed like negative space. Her name was not spoken at feasts. No one invited her when the dancing began. Every sound seemed designed to highlight her absence, and that absence became its own presence, a haunting echo, lingering after the chapel bells ceased. One curious letter was discovered in the royal archives in the 20th century, written by a maid who once served Elizabeth. In it, she recalled how Mary would whisper prayers on full moon nights, not in Latin, but in Old Spanish, clinging to her mother's language, her roots. Her voice, the maid wrote, was not one of pleading, but of resistance to forgetting. The wind slipped through hibiscus hedges, skimmed across a still pond where black swans floated in dreamlike circles, unaware of politics. In that setting, Mary's loneliness did not explode into rage. It dripped slowly, like water from a rooftop, eroding even what once seemed unshakable. A century later, as queens rose and history moved on, few remembered the time when Mary was neither princess nor queen, as though that chapter, her most sorrowful, was one unfit to be recalled. And yet, it was within that space that the heart of a future monarch learned this: titles may be taken, but if faith lives on, it becomes fire. That early winter morning was cold in a strange way, not the biting frost of the north, but a slow, creeping chill that seeped inward. No wind, only fog hung thick, like a shroud, over stone corridors where light was smothered between pillars and curtains heavy with the scent of old incense. The news of Catherine of Aragon's death did not arrive through a royal messenger, but as a soft murmur in the kitchen, between the smell of baking bread and the hiss of smouldering wood. Mary was not summoned. No letter, no formal condolences. She knew her mother was gone, not because anyone told her, but because her soul had already felt the loss. On the 7th of January, in the year 1536, Catherine drew her last breath at Kimbolton Castle. Her servants recounted that she never relinquished the title Queen of England. She closed her eyes, clutching her rosary beads, and whispered with her final breath, "Mary, hija mia." That same day, at Whitehall Palace, King Henry VIII and Queen Anne Boleyn celebrated a small feast, cups raised, Little Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, wore golden silk, toddling between applause. Mary sat alone in her room, a single candle flickering on the desk. She stared into nothing, eyes too dry for more tears. A white handkerchief with Spanish lace, her mother's last gift, was clenched tightly in her hand all night, leaving faint impressions on her skin. She was forbidden to attend the funeral. The king refused. "Only if she acknowledges me as supreme head of the church and Anne as rightful queen," he declared. "Will she be allowed to see her mother off?" Mary said nothing, but something within her quietly broke. Not like shattered glass, but like ice cracking beneath a still lake. A small, silent fissure, slowly widening until the entire surface gave way. That official event, Catherine's death, marked the complete end of Spanish influence in the English court. From that moment on, Anne Boleyn became the new emblem, and Elizabeth the bright future of the Tudor line. But few mention that in her final hours, Catherine was confined in a damp room, sleeping on a bed with one broken leg and a fire too weak to warm her. A queen, dying like a forgotten nun. Historians still debate the true cause of Catherine's death. Some forensic records later suggested slow poisoning by heavy metals, traces found in her nails and hair. But no definitive conclusion was ever reached. When Henry heard of the theory, he is said to have smiled and replied, "If true, then it's a matter between heaven and earth. As for me, I live to rebuild England." Mary did not smile. She no longer wept. From that night onward, she began walking under the moon, never carrying a lantern, guided only by moonlight and her own footsteps. The servants said each of her steps seemed to cut into the stone, even though she wore soft shoes. And when wind passed through the corridors, they heard singing low, ancient, slow, Latin hymns long banned by the court, sung as if each word was a candle lit for her mother's soul. Few knew that in Mary's room still hung a small painting of the Virgin Mary, background in deep blue, the brushstrokes blurred with time. On its surface was a greyish stain, perhaps a tear fallen long ago. No one dared move the painting when someone once tried. Mary turned away and remained silent for the rest of the day. Here, the seed of resentment took root. Not the fierce kind that burns fast, but a slow ember hidden under ash. She resented not only Elizabeth, who bore the title once hers, but also the world that watched her fall, silently, and took everything away. Among hoofbeats at the gate and chapel bells in the morning, Mary still fasted every Friday, still wore a black veil during Mass, and still wrote lines from the Psalms in her diary. But her handwriting grew heavier, slanted, with pen strokes pressed too hard, like sobs trapped in ink. A 21st century scholar once wrote, "Mary never learned to forgive, not because she was cruel, but because no one taught her how to be forgiven." It's not in the textbooks, not written in royal chronicles, but it lies between the lines where the breath of a once princess lingers like a flame that never fully died. Outside, light rain began to fall, not enough to wet the sleeves, but enough to veil the garden in velvet mist. Mary stood under the archway, looking up at the sky. Perhaps she was praying, or perhaps just listening for her mother's voice, echoing from some distant, cold, and gentle place. That morning the fog was so thick the trees in the garden vanished behind a silver veil. No birds sang, only the sound of water dripping steadily from the palace roof to the cold earth below. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something that had already happened or was about to end. Mary stood by the window, fingertips brushing the misted glass. No one told her, yet she knew. Anne Boleyn, the woman who had made all of England kneel before her beauty and ambition, had been executed at the Tower of London. The event took place on the 19th of May, in the year 1536. A grey morning, the wind soft, and a French swordsman summoned from Calais, carrying a blade finely honed. No English axe, only a sword swift and merciful, as the king had said. Upon the wooden scaffold, among a crowd of thousands, the woman once called queen, now a traitor, knelt, hair unbound, whispering a prayer. When steel cut air, they said the wind shifted, and for a brief instant the sky grew bright as noon. A lesser-known story claims that before the execution, Anne Boleyn asked her maid to bring her a small linen pouch filled with sparrow feathers. "When the sparrow flies," she said, "my soul will be free." Whether truth or myth, Victorian scholars later found in the palace archive an object matching the description sealed in beeswax. Sender unknown, perhaps a legend, perhaps the trace of a promise. Historians still debate why Henry VIII ordered Anne's death. Some believe it was simply to marry Jane Seymour, the quiet woman who calmed his weary heart. Others argue he sought not just to remove a wife, but to erase a memory, the memory of defiance, of a woman who dared to challenge his will in both love and faith. Whatever the reason, when Anne fell, an entire chapter of England's story ended in silence. Mary did not cry. She did not rejoice. Within her, something dimmed the way fire turns to ember, still warm, no longer bright. Henry sent word. He wished his daughter to sign a document acknowledging herself illegitimate, naming him as supreme head of the Church of England, and renouncing her mother's rightful marriage. In return, she could return to court. If not, she would remain forgotten. Mary was silent for a long time, perhaps days, perhaps years in thought. Then she signed. Her hand trembled slightly but remained firm. No one knew her thoughts. Some letters between courtiers record Henry's satisfaction and fatherly mercy. Yet witnesses claimed that after signing, Mary simply whispered, "I live to see." Thus she returned. Not a princess, not a prisoner, something in between. Whitehall Palace had changed. New tapestries, new portraits of Queen Jane Seymour, bright scents of mint and citrus replacing the heavy incense of Catherine's reign. Mary walked through the lit corridors, listening to the laughter of courtiers, and in each laugh she heard a cold wind carrying the faint smell of metal, of power, of forgetting. Few noticed that after returning to court, Mary began keeping a journal written with ink made from oak, ash, and red wine, a gift from a Spanish friar. When dry, it turned a deep brown, the colour of old blood. In one surviving page, she wrote, "I will not reclaim my crown. I will reclaim the truth." The letters leaned, fragile as hair in the wind, yet heavy with promise. The air at court shifted. Henry grew gentler toward his daughter, invited her to banquets, even once gave her a pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother. "I have always loved you, Lady Mary," he said, his tone suggesting confidence in forgiveness. Mary bowed, smiling faintly. A smile no one could tell was gratitude or irony. One afternoon she saw Elizabeth in the garden, chasing a ball of yarn across the grass. The little girl's dress tangled in the stems. Her golden hair catching the Sunday Mary stopped and watched. The child turned, eyes bright, unafraid. She curtsied. "Lady Mary," she said sweetly. Mary nodded. For a moment, her chest ached not from hatred, but from the strange knowledge that none of this was the child's fault. Yet when Elizabeth ran off again, leaving sunlight trembling on the lawn, a quiet coldness returned like the shadow of the past, touching her heart. Modern scholars often say it was during this time that Mary mastered the subtle art of survival, the art of silence. She did not argue, did not rebel, but remembered everything. Some describe her as the quiet ghost of power, authority not in action, but in memory. And memory, as we know, sometimes outlasts thrones. Night fell. The palace sank into violet dusk. From the hall came the faint sound of a lute. Mary sat by her window, moonlight spreading across her calm face. She placed a hand on her chest, feeling her heartbeat steady, waiting. Somewhere in her breath, in the dim light, in the stillness of the hour, a flame still burned, silent, deep, and cold. Morning light touched the lake at Hampton Court Palace with a gentle hush. Mist like silk floated across the surface, catching the sun's first glimmers like gold melting over glass. The willow trees bowed low, their branches heavy with dew. The air was cool, hushed, and filled with a quiet waiting as though the world were holding its breath for something that had already gone. Henry VIII died on the 28th of January, in the year 1547. He passed in the early hours, surrounded by incense and the faint rustle of bed curtains. After more than 30 years on the throne, 6 wives, 3 children, and a reformed church, the king at last let go. In his final hours, he is said to have called for Jane Seymour, the wife who gave him a son and died too young. Some servants claimed he whispered Mary's name. Does my daughter still keep the faith? Word spread in handwritten letters sealed in red wax. When Mary received hers, she showed no visible emotion. She nodded, closed her eyes, and walked out into the garden despite the light rain. No one asked, no one dared, for they had long learned to leave Mary to her silence. And so Edward, the slender boy with bright eyes, Henry's only son, took the throne. He was only 9. The streets of London were dressed in flags and flowers, but the sky stayed grey, and some whispered that the swallows had not flown over the tower that year. One little-known detail. During the coronation, Edward's robe slipped from his shoulders twice, and a nobleman used golden pins to fasten it. Not a good sign, murmured a candle seller near the chapel. The official event, the reign of Edward VI, began England's first truly Protestant king. Under his reformist guardians, the country moved further from Rome. Latin hymns vanished, replaced by English prayers. Statues of the Virgin were removed. A new prayer book was issued, in simpler words that felt foreign to Mary. Mary held her ground. In her private home, she continued the old rituals. Latin Mass, candles on Fridays, whispered prayers before hidden statues. Elizabeth, her half-sister, moved in another direction, reading in French, studying humanist philosophy, debating with tutors about England's future. Her room was bright with candles, her table cluttered with books, the air full of questions. Mary's world, by contrast, was like an abandoned chapel, every breath echoing with the past. Historians still debate the true dynamic between the sisters during this period. Some records suggest Mary felt a quiet jealousy toward Elizabeth's charm and intelligence. Others argue Elizabeth, though younger, always showed respectful distance. One account claims they once lit Christmas candles together, but only for one winter. After that, the frost never melted. When the court ordered Mary to stop holding Catholic Mass, she refused not with rebellion, but with quiet. She closed the doors, held her rites alone, and said nothing, but the candles still burned. "This is not rebellion," she wrote in a letter. "It is loyalty that does not change with language." The ink was brown, the handwriting slanted, like a voice speaking in shadows. Edward weakened. His cough deepened. His hands shook when he wrote. His letters grew shorter, as if he lacked the strength to give full commands. In a rare request, he asked to see Mary. No records remain of what they said. But one servant noted that after their meeting, Mary sat for hours on the stone steps, holding a piece of blue silk, the colour Edward always wore. Then one summer day, in the year 1553, the chapel bell rang 3 long times. Edward was gone. He was only 15. It did not rain, but no sun was seen. Lavender was strewn across the floor of his room, a ritual to ward off spirits, though few believed scent could stop truth. Mary did not attend the official funeral. But that night, she ordered 33 candles lit, 1 for each year her father lived, 1 for each month her brother reigned. The last candle burned till dawn, wax dripping onto her hand. She did not pull away. And so, the throne sat empty again. In the shadows, behind thick walls and flickering light, a new wind stirred, and Mary, with slow breath, deep memory, and a flame never dimmed, still waited. A short morning rain left thin puddles on the stone floors of Hampton Court Palace. Chestnut leaves, scattered and damp, carried a bitter resin scent in the breeze. The air tasted faintly of iron and earth. Far off, toward the Tower of London, hoofbeats echoed in rhythm like the heartbeat of a kingdom holding still. Edward had died, at only 15 years of age. No trumpets, no grand procession, only a black velvet banner lowered from the royal balcony at dusk, and a handwritten letter sealed in red wax. Servants lined the halls, heads bowed. Priests nodded in silence. Old women selling herbs whispered, "She will return." She, of course, was Mary. Soon after Edward's passing, a group of reformist nobles tried to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne. A 16-year-old girl, shy and pale, was pushed onto the chessboard of power like a pawn. Jane was proclaimed queen, wore the crown with disbelief, and ascended the throne with eyes that seemed to wonder if she were still dreaming. But the true historical event lay elsewhere. Mary, daughter of Henry, reclaimed the crown in 9 days. She rode from Norfolk, passing through villages where crowds gathered to cheer, bringing bread and red ribbons. No great army, no gleaming weapons, only belief. The elderly held wooden crosses, children sang in Old Latin. A woman once labelled heretic, bastard, and relic of the past was welcomed as a saviour. Few noticed that Mary wore no armour, no helmet, only a deep violet cloak and her mother's old gloves. On a white horse, beneath a grey sky, she became a symbol of something ancient and unextinguished. Historians still debate whether Mary's ascent was truly fueled by the will of the people or the work of Catholic nobles behind the scenes. Some emphasize the Eastern gentry who rallied local troops in her name. Others argue Jane's fall was inevitable, a reign founded not in bloodline, but in ink and hope. As always, history does not wait for certainty to proceed. On the 13th of July in the year 1553, Mary was declared the lawful Queen of England, the first woman to reign in her own right, not as wife or mother of a king. That day, it neither rained nor shone. The sky simply held its breath, as if it too were unsure this was real. Elizabeth was at Hatfield House. Upon hearing of Mary's victory, she said only, "My sister is worthy." No shock, no panic, just a distant look toward the horizon. She understood this was not her time. And if Elizabeth possessed one unmatched talent, it was patience. When the sisters met outside London, the scene was said to be like a painting in mist. Mary on a white horse, Elizabeth on a chestnut one, both in velvet, surrounded by hundreds of horsemen with armour gleaming under the fading Sunday. Mary was solemn, her gaze revealing nothing but clarity. Elizabeth humble, but not small. She bowed deeply, and in that bow, some saw the shape of a future waiting. A lesser-known detail. When Mary ascended the throne, she had the great tapestry at Westminster, rewoven depicting the Virgin Mary blessing a kneeling queen. In one corner, a weaver stitched a hidden line, "Fiat voluntas Dei, let thy will be done." Whether Mary noticed it or not, no one knows. Soon after her coronation, Mary ordered the restoration of Catholic Mass, the return of old churches, and the repeal of Protestant liturgies. Candles once snuffed were relit. Statues of the Virgin returned to their altars. Latin returned to the lips of priests. And Mary the Queen, who carried her mother's memory, believed justice had been restored. Elizabeth, meanwhile, stayed silent. She attended ceremonies, knelt at the right moments, smiled just enough. But in her eyes was something not of the present. She memorized every decree, every order. And each time she watched her sister ascend the dais, she did not see triumph. She saw weight. Perhaps that is why, when night fell, Mary could not sleep. She sat by the Whitehall Tower window, staring east toward the old roads of her childhood. Night wind slipped through the lattice, carrying the scent of ashes and spent candles. No songs, only unspoken sighs. She had claimed the crown, but the cold in her heart had not yet left. On a foggy afternoon, when the sun had sunk so low that it cast no clear shadows, a flock of black crows gathered thick atop the roof of the old church at Smithfield. The wind slipped through half-closed wooden doors, weaving its way into empty houses, carrying the scent of damp wood, cold ashes, and half-burnt hay. No one spoke loudly on days like this, not even the chapel bells rang quickly. They were drawn out, slow, as if afraid to shatter the air stretched thin like still water. In the middle of this pale picture, Mary Tudor walked the cold stone halls of her palace. She was queen, ruler, centre of the court, but also entirely alone. The cost of power, at times, is not isolation, but a silence so deep one can no longer hear their own thoughts. Within a year of her coronation, Mary began to fully restore Catholicism. The old candles were lit again, long-abandoned chapels reconsecrated, and new proclamations issued, declaring England's return to the Roman Church. A historical event, the Act of Repeal, passed in the year 1554, officially overturned all religious reforms from the reigns of Henry VIII and Edward VI. To Mary, it was healing. To many others it was the return of shadow, and so a campaign of purification began. Those who refused to renounce Protestantism were declared heretics, and by the laws of the time, heresy could mean death by fire. At first, only a few, but the flame did not stop. Smithfield, a square once used for cattle markets, became a place of public execution. Dry wood was stacked high. The air was thick with the smell of burning fat, hair, cloth. People came to watch not out of cruelty, but because, in that time, no one dared look away. Few know that Mary never directly ordered the executions. She only approved laws, appointed those responsible, and left God's will to decide. In a private letter to Cardinal Pole, her closest advisor, Mary once wrote, "I find no joy in fire, but I find no truth in the shadows of compromise." Historians still debate how involved Mary truly was. Some say she was manipulated by conservative clergy, a devout queen unwilling to oppose church doctrine. Others argue her unwavering belief fueled the Red Storm, a belief born from childhood, her mother's death, her own imprisonment, and prayers whispered in Latin. Nearly 300 people were burned, including women and children. They were recorded as martyrs, while later generations would name Mary Bloody Mary, a term coined not by her court, but in English taverns of the 17th century, where old stories were told to scare children into obedience. As always, history prefers to simplify complex women. Meanwhile, Elizabeth remained silent. She lived under strict surveillance. Every letter she wrote was reviewed, every step watched, yet she did not resist. She was careful, proper, patient. Once, when one of her maids muttered criticism of Mary while sewing a dress, Elizabeth calmly corrected her. "I never allow anyone to insult the Queen, not even with a needle." Still, the court knew she was the only heir. Mary had no children, and age was catching her. Hopes for an heir dwindled, and Elizabeth, with her keen mind, quiet composure, and Protestant past, became an unspoken symbol of a different future. A little-known fact: Mary once ordered Elizabeth to stay at Hampton Court for a winter to be closer to the court. Yet during those 3 months, they met only 3 times. Each meeting was short, polite, and no one spoke of what lay ahead. After the final visit, Elizabeth returned to her room and asked her tailor to stitch the lining of her dress shut, as if even trust now required hidden seams. That winter was long, cold, unyielding. Fires still burned in Smithfield, but in the minds of the people, a different flame began to flicker, not of Catholicism or Protestantism, but something softer, the hope that fear might one day end. By candlelight in the royal chapel, Mary still knelt, lips murmuring old prayers. She believed she was bringing England's soul back to God, and Elizabeth, in the quiet of her small chamber, learned to read political maps through smiles and glances. Each night she wrote a few lines in Latin, always ending the same way: "Vivat qui patitur." He who endures, lives. Not all darkness is pitch black. Some shadows are grey, soft, slowly eroding trust like frost eats away at old brass. Inside the Tower of London, where moss-covered stones seemed to breathe the sorrow of countless lost souls, Elizabeth entered the quietest moment of her life. The guards' footsteps echoed steadily, like a blind clock. 1, 2, 3, then silence. Each night, she counted those echoes as she floated between life and death. No one explained why she had been taken, but everyone understood. Mary suspected. And when rumours of Wyatt's rebellion swept through London, Elizabeth became the most dangerous shadow, a living symbol of potential betrayal. The iron gate closed behind her like a whisper in steel. "You're not here to speak, only to be silent." Oh, the historical record is clear. In March of the year 1554, Elizabeth was taken to the Tower of London following the failed rebellion of Thomas Wyatt. Wyatt, a Protestant nobleman, had attempted to overthrow Mary and install Elizabeth as queen. The rebellion was swiftly crushed, but suspicion does not die so easily. With no hard evidence, Elizabeth was imprisoned, questioned, and nearly executed. The Tower was not new to the Tudor bloodline here. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had once been executed over a decade before, and on her first night, Elizabeth sat silently on a cold wooden bench, moonlight slicing through the bars, her hand resting at her collar where her mother's neck had once met the blade. Not a single tear, only breath, long and thin, as if afraid to wake the past. It is said that during her imprisonment, Elizabeth requested an embroidery needle not to mend clothes, but to ward off madness. Every morning she stitched a small line on a white cloth, a short mark, "I live today." A little-known fact, the needle was later found in a small wooden box she kept all her life, etched faintly with the words "Silentia fortitudo est." Silence is strength. Historians still debate whether Mary truly intended to sign Elizabeth's execution warrant. Some records say she held the pen, hand trembling, and stopped. Others believe Cardinal Pole intervened, reminding Mary of the sin of spilling kin's blood. Still, others propose that it was Philip of Spain, Mary's future husband, who advised keeping Elizabeth alive as a diplomatic asset. A queen doesn't always get the final word. Inside the tower, time didn't flow, it pooled. Stone walls drank the mist, brick floors oozed salt from the Thames. Each morning Elizabeth was allowed into a small yard to breathe the air. Not from mercy, but so the guards could confirm she still lived. She didn't speak, but every step, each boot tapping on damp tile, was a statement. "I will leave here, whatever it takes." Mary then, 38 years old, sat alone in Whitehall Palace, reading reports from spies, churches, Spain. Her eyes ached from prayers, from politics, from sleepless nights. She thought of Elizabeth as one thinks of an old backache, never fatal, but never ignorable. Kill her sister? Where was justice? Where was God? But if she let her live, was she planting betrayal? One night, recorded by Mary's private secretary, the Queen stayed awake until dawn, just sitting by a candle, doing nothing. She muttered only one line. Strange, how those closest feel most like enemies. Elizabeth was finally released, but not freed. She was sent to Hatfield under strict surveillance. Before leaving the tower, she paused at the main gate, gazing up at the stone statue of St. Michael on the roof. Her lips moved. No one heard. But later she would say, "I swore I would never return there unless as queen." The morning light was strange that day, soft, pale gold, like egg yolk bathed in mist. Wind from the Thames blew gently, carrying a salt-wet promise, yet unspoken. As Elizabeth stepped past the stone gate, the old guard who had served at the tower since the days of Henry VIII bowed his head slightly. A curious gesture, not in the manuals, just an old man seeing something in a young woman that needed no words. From that day on, Elizabeth learned one vital truth. The crown does not belong to the pitiful. It belongs to the patient, the cautious, and the one who knows exactly when to strike. In the ashen sky of that spring, clouds thick like old silk stretched across the palace rooftops. The wind was not strong, just enough to gently stir lace curtains, as if invisible hands were tapping on the window frame with a quiet omen. Mary, in a cloak of fox fur, placed her hand on her stomach. That gesture repeated many times each day, a reflex of hope. She had declared herself pregnant a great joy, a chance to reverse fate, to extend the Catholic line upon the English throne. The entire court, from dukes, cardinals, to chambermaids, whispered blessings. Church bells rang longer than usual. In the palace, a special room was prepared for the child, the heir yet to be born. Each morning, sunlight streamed through the stained glass of Hampton Court Palace, casting golden hues across the stone walls. Midwives wandered the halls with baskets of herbs and pouches scented with holy crosses. It was said, if the child were a boy, peace would return. If a girl, at least it would be Mary's child, not one born of betrayal. But time passed. In the 7th month, Mary's belly no longer grew. There were no movements, no pains, no water, only a deepening silence. Doctors in long black robes whispered outside the Queen's chamber. Some claimed it was a hidden pregnancy, a medieval belief that the fetus could sleep still for many months. Others sighed and said nothing. Prayers filled the chapel daily, but the air carried more incense than faith. The event is well documented in historical records. In the year 1555, Queen Mary I declared herself pregnant. A baptism was planned, even godparents chosen, but no child was ever born. No blood, no cry, no heir. After months of waiting, the palace quietly retracted the proclamation. Mary had never been pregnant. That simple truth descended like frost. An illusion, a dream never given shape, a shadow among hopeful light. Historians still debate what truly happened. Some believe Mary suffered from pseudocyesis, a psychological condition so powerful that the body mimics pregnancy. Others suspect it was a form of ovarian tumor, possibly cancer. Another theory suggests the entire pregnancy was a desperate political fabrication, a court orchestration to retain support for the Queen during unrest. The truth? Perhaps locked in a chest somewhere, or buried with Mary herself. A little-known fact: during the so-called pregnancy, Mary wrote a letter to the Pope, describing in detail the feeling of a small soul sleeping within me. Her tone was gentle, vague, as if she too was uncertain of its truth. Philip, her husband, Prince of Spain, remained by her side for the first few months. But as silence stretched and physical signs failed to appear, he departed England. Not in anger, but in understanding. Without a child, there was no future. He returned to wars in Italy, to the political chessboard of Habsburg power. Mary remained amid vast hallways void of laughter, and a throne growing as cold as stone. Meanwhile, Elizabeth, though she spoke not a word, began to regain light. Her silence was interpreted in many ways: loyalty, wisdom, strategy. Regardless, the court's eyes slowly turned toward her, as sunflowers tilt toward light. Mary seldom left her chambers. She still wore the crown, still upheld ceremony, but her eyes no longer blazed. Those eyes, once burning with faith, were now weary, clouded with mist. In her private room, she read scripture not to persuade others, but to anchor herself. The bed where Mary once placed her hand on her stomach now seemed too large. One October night, she looked up at the ceiling, where circular motifs repeated like the wheels of fate, and whispered, "Does God make promises, then forget?" Wind slipped through the window frame. No one answered. There was no bell to mark the fading of a queen. Only fog, thicker than usual, clung to the banks of the River Thames, white like ash coating the stone steps of St. James's Palace. The doves no longer circled the bell tower. The western wind, usually so restless, whispered softly, as if listening for each final breath. Mary, Queen of Winter, lay upon a velvet-draped bed. The candlelight danced gently on her cheek, a face now hollow, pale, waxen. In that chamber, the scent of incense mingled with lavender oil, drifting slowly. The kingdom knew. The flame was fading. Mary's illness was never consistently recorded. Some sources suggest liver failure. Others mention ovarian cancer, perhaps continuing from the mystery of her false pregnancy. Letters from Spain hinted at deep melancholy. She ate little, often slept for days. She was known to repeat a single line from scripture: "I have watched, but he has not come." The story of the death of Mary I, England's first true reigning queen, is a sad ending. Not because it was tragic, but because it was so quiet. Historians still debate: was Mary truly the failure history claims? Some argue she simply lacked time. Financial reform, Baltic trade, naval foundations all began under her reign. Yet posterity remembers only the fires and the name Bloody Mary. Few know this. A month before her death, Mary commissioned a local composer to write a new coronation hymn for her successor. No one knows why, but that melody, sombre, dreamlike, was later used at Elizabeth's own crowning. A small trace, but tender, amid bitterness. Outside, down the stone halls, nobles had begun sending gifts to Hatfield House, where Elizabeth waited. Invitations for tea, gentle melodies, signs of shifting loyalty. No declarations were needed, just silence and glances in another direction. Mary saw it. Though her eyes blurred, she recognized letters from those once calling her Holy Mother, now ending with, "May your Majesty rest in peace." No one wrote praying for recovery anymore, only, "May God welcome you soon." Elizabeth was permitted into the palace not to say goodbye, but to wait. She arrived in silver grey, stood at the door, not stepping in unless summoned. Mary did not summon, but she did not send her away. They did not speak. They didn't need to. Some silences weigh more than 10,000 words. Mary turned to the window. On the last morning she remained conscious. The fog had lifted, revealing the pale winter Sunday. That light touched the old painting above her bed, a Madonna holding an infant. She looked at it for a long time, then turned away. Mary I died on the 17th of November in the year 1558 at St. James's Palace. She left no child, and her successor was Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, once viewed by Mary as the emblem of heresy. She died at age 42. No clear will, but she accepted Elizabeth as heir not from affection, but because there was no one else. One woman departed. Another was named. That morning the sky was not glorious. Only a silver light, like a thin silk drifting across the misted rooftops. The church bells did not ring out triumphantly, but chimed in distant echoes, quietly as if summoning memories rather than announcing joy. Elizabeth did not wear mourning black. She chose an ivory cloak, trimmed in pale gold thread, and thin gloves embroidered with asters, the late-blooming flower. She did not cry, nor did she smile. She only walked in silence through the stone corridors of Whitehall Palace, where the throne now waited. On the 17th of November, in the year 1558, the Tudor dynasty changed hands once more. For the second time in England's history, a woman stepped onto the throne, not as a queen consort, but as the monarch herself. No battles, no blood spilled, only a transition soft as a sigh. Historians still debate Elizabeth's true reaction when she received news of her sister's death. Some accounts say she collapsed to her knees, whispering in Latin, "This is the Lord's doing." Others suggest she only bowed her head, then continued her breakfast of barley bread and honey, rather like modern politicians concealing their feelings on live broadcasts not out of coldness, but because cameras are rarely kind to tears. A lesser-known fact. Immediately after being proclaimed queen, Elizabeth ordered that no flags be flown at half-mast for Mary's funeral, not out of hatred, but with the reasoning, "We do not mourn a queen who fulfilled her duty, we welcome a new age." Elizabeth's succession did not begin in London. She was at Hatfield when she received the news, a quiet estate, some 30 miles outside the city. In the garden that autumn day, among bare chestnut trees, she walked slowly with a handful of close courtiers. Leaves had fallen into a soft blanket underfoot, rustling gently like the steady heartbeat of history. A light breeze stirred the air. Elizabeth stopped, turned her face to the sky, and witnesses say the sunlight broke through the boughs and fell upon her brow, as though the sun itself had chosen a figure to rise beneath. No one said a word, only the blackbirds sang, somewhere far off. On the 17th of November, in the year 1558, Elizabeth Tudor was officially recognised as Queen Elizabeth I of England, succeeding her half-sister Mary. She was embraced not only as the legitimate heir, but as the only ruler capable of soothing a nation worn thin by religious severity. When Elizabeth began her journey to the capital, the people lined the roads as if greeting the return of light after a long storm. Children carried laurel branches. Women tossed rose petals over the muddy path. Some shouted, "Our true queen," while others simply stood in reverent silence, hands clasped before them like in church. That moment has been captured in many paintings. Curiously, one of the artists commissioned to paint Elizabeth's early portrait was none other than Hans Eworth, the same man who had painted Queen Mary. The same hand, two faces, one sombre, one radiant, and perhaps both, in truth, were masks for the same tragedy. One of Elizabeth's first acts as queen was to order all the pillows in the royal bedchambers to be replaced from crimson silk to ivory white. When asked why, she replied simply, "I do not wish to sleep upon blood." The official coronation took place in Westminster Abbey early the following January. But even on her first return to London, Elizabeth was received as a monarch. Beneath flickering candlelight, she climbed the abbey steps with sceptre in hand, gaze unwavering. Some writings note, she trembled not from fear, but from unfamiliarity with high-heeled shoes. The cold stone beneath her feet echoed beneath harp strings, whose notes drifted through the air like waves pushing her gently toward her destiny. Whispers stirred among the clergy. Could an unmarried woman, daughter of that witch Anne Boleyn, truly lead a kingdom? Among the people, none of that mattered. They saw her kneel in prayer before the altar, and in that quiet moment, no one remembered the tower cell where she had once awaited death. Historians still argue over whether Elizabeth truly believed in forgiveness, or whether her mercy was calculated politics. Her decisions to pardon many of Mary's allies, and spare even the most ardent Catholic priests, were seen by some as symbols of tolerance. Others suggest it was a deliberate cooling of tensions before deeper reforms. And on her first night sleeping in the royal palace, Elizabeth requested that no lamps be lit, only that the window be left open so moonlight could fall across the pillow. The air was cold. The hall clock ticked slowly, one beat at a time. Her heart was steady, not because she felt safe, but because danger had now become a constant companion. No one called her princess anymore. No one dared speak the name Anne with scorn. As for Mary, the sister who had sent hundreds to burn for their beliefs, now lay beneath the earth, in a simple oak coffin. Elizabeth did not attend the burial, but sent a white laurel wreath to be laid upon the grave. For one who burned in faith, the early morning wind threaded through the stained glass windows of Westminster Chapel, weaving between pale golden rays like moss growing on ancient stone. The scent of smouldering candles curled through the air like the breath of time, warm but shadowed. Incense lingered at the edge of Elizabeth's collar as she stepped slowly toward the throne, the hem of her silk gown trailing across the cold tiles like a river searching for its sea. The cries of "Queen Elizabeth!" erupted from the ranks of nobility, mingling with murmurs that were not quite prayers and not quite fear. But she remained silent, not out of pride, but because silence could say everything. On the 15th of January, in the year 1559, Elizabeth was formally crowned. The coronation was not held at the Tower of London as tradition dictated, for that place had once been her prison. Instead, she chose Westminster Palace, as though she meant to dissolve the old memory and begin a new era, but to do so quietly. Historians still debate the true reason behind this choice. Was it merely to avoid the spirits of vengeance that haunted the tower, or simply because the echoes there sounded too much like the crackling of a pyre? England welcomed its new queen with hope and a trace of doubt. While many cheered, more than a few others sighed. Another woman on the throne. Time had begun to allow women to reign, but faith in them remained fragile. The coronation of Elizabeth I on the 15th of January, in the year 1559, marked the beginning of a glorious era known as the Elizabethan Age. It also symbolically restored the legacy of the Boleyn family, though no one would say it aloud. In a letter written in her careful round hand to her old tutor Edward Ascham, Elizabeth wrote, "I ascend the throne not only with my mind, but with the shadows of the dead trailing behind my steps." The royal doublet Elizabeth wore at her coronation was embroidered with thread, partly melted down from a ring that had once belonged to Anne Boleyn, her mother, formally executed. Though she never spoke of it, Elizabeth always carried a trace of Anne near her skin. When people recall the day the Queen first took her throne, they remember the jewels and praises. But in a forgotten corner of a courtier's notes, someone once described the faraway, delicate look in Elizabeth's eyes as she faced the crowded chamber, like a gaze measuring not right or wrong, but survival versus longer survival. At that time, far away, Philip, the husband who had left Mary, sent no word of congratulations. And somehow, that seemed to make Elizabeth smile faintly. After all, a throne is never just a chair. It is a stage on which those who sit must play a role. Elizabeth began her performance not with a proclamation, but with a long breath on the balcony of Whitehall Palace. She said, "I come not for bloodline nor title, but to show that in the end, patience too can be a form of ferocity." Morning mist still clung to the carved arches of Westminster Abbey when Mary's funeral began. The priest's footsteps echoed softly, like dew falling on cold stone. Elizabeth, clad in soft ivory mourning, walked beside her sister's simple oak coffin, both victor and victim, having consumed her own realm to uphold faith. There were no cries, only the wind's quiet sigh through stained glass windows depicting the saints. Mary's coffin was laid beside a blank tomb reserved for Elizabeth, an arrangement the sisters had agreed upon in life, to rest under the same vaulted roof. It was a silent gesture, almost sardonic. Two queens, two fates, inextricably bound. On the 30th of December, in the year 1558, Mary I was interred at Westminster Abbey, adjacent to the tomb prepared for Elizabeth. This marked the first time a former queen was buried alongside her successor, inaugurating a new chapter in English royal tradition. Before the lid closed, Elizabeth bent low to whisper a prayer, her voice trembling slightly. "Rest easy. I have learned from you how to keep the flame alive." She then placed a wreath of winter jasmine, Mary's favourite, upon the coffin, in a quiet farewell. By court protocol, funeral wreaths were traditionally made of frankincense. Yet Elizabeth secretly chose winter jasmine, a flower that blooms in frost, as a whispered promise. You will not lie alone in the cold. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth truly wished to be buried beside Mary, or if it was a political formality, a way to heal the turbulent past and consolidate power. Others believe Elizabeth genuinely empathized with Mary's solitude and sought to share the tomb as an act of redemption. As the stone lid settled, dawn's light filtered through the high window, illuminating a carved double crown, one ornate, one simple. The mourners exchanged knowing glances. History not only buries the past, but also binds those who came before and after. In that moment, no one spoke. Only the soft whisper of wind through the great doors and the distant toll of the Abbey bells. Westminster Abbey, with centuries of memory, welcomed both Mary and Elizabeth into its silent embrace. Elizabeth returned through the quiet halls like a pupil, leaving her final class. Within the palace, courtiers quietly began plotting the future church reforms, diplomacy, finance. But high above, beneath the still arches, only two queens etched in stone reminded all that the crown is built on blood, tears, and the slow grace of forgiveness. Under the pale moonlight of that late spring night, Elizabeth often found herself alone before the empty throne. The wind drifted through the half-open window, carrying faint jasmine scents and whispers of rustling leaves, soft as distant prayers. A dying candle left beads of white wax on the wooden frame, like falling moments marking the end of an era. She remembered Mary, her sister, who had defended faith with red flames, leaving behind a kingdom both scarred and hopeful. There was neither affection nor hatred, only a quiet reverence. Mary and she, two women, two fates, had shown the world that power was not reserved for men. The Thames flowed silently beyond the walls, comforting each memory, carrying away bitterness, and leaving peace. On the 23rd of March in the year 1603, Elizabeth passed away at Whitehall Palace, concluding 45 years of reign, a period later hailed as the Golden Age. Under the silver moonlight, the throne fell silent. Only footsteps whispered of those who had passed through. In her final months, Elizabeth frequently bathed in warm water by a window overlooking the river. She left behind a white ostrich feather fan, the very first gift she had given Mary, after ascending the throne as a faint memento of their unfinished sisterhood. That fan now rests in the royal archives, a silent witness to a story untold. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth truly regretted the fires lit during Mary's reign. Some believe she saw them as painful lessons in compassion, while others claim her silence was a calculated move to safeguard her power and leave no room for reproach. Each night, Elizabeth sat before the vacant throne, listening to the wind hum through the stone arches and the river's pulse beyond the ramparts. Every slow breath was a lullaby, every swaying tree in the garden a dance of departed souls. The waning moon cast a soft shadow, much like the memory of Mary, incomplete yet ever present. Finally, she extinguished the candle, leaving only a faint glow from the sliver of moon outside. The wooden door closed gently, and Elizabeth leaned back, eyes closed, letting serenity envelop her. The palace lay in hushed anticipation of the dawn and of a kingdom awaking with a new queen in its heart. Now, as you prepare to close your own eyes, remember, just as the moon waxes and wanes, all cycles return. Let the wind lull you, let the leaves serenade you, let sleep arrive softly. Good night, and may your dreams be as gentle as the final footsteps beside that empty throne. Good night.